Welcome, everybody, to our first Fellows findings for 2026. We begin by, of course, acknowledging that, well, I'm on Gadigal land in the State Library of New South Wales. We know that this site has been a site of knowledge and sharing of experiences for millennia. And as we move into 2026, in fact, today is anniversary of this library, turns 200 today. So that's a big year for us. 2026 is going to be a very significant year for the library, and you'll hear more about that throughout the year, no doubt. But of course, this library has been collecting for 200 years, so that puts what our collections are into some perspective. They are great storehouses of knowledge, lack of knowledge indeed, and many of our fellows that you will hear across this year have worked deeply and engagingly with our collections. And this fellowship, the Fellows Findings, in fact, is a series we run on the first Tuesday of every month at 11 a.m, where we allow our fellows to, or we invite our fellows to reflect on what they have learned working at the library. The way this works, I think if you've been attending these before, no doubt under the excellent tutelage of Dr. Rachel Frank, so I'm stepping in while she's away for today. If you do have questions, these can be submitted to me on the Q&A button at the top of your screen. I will then relay them to Perry at the end of the presentation. Now, of course, we're here today to hear Dr. Perry McIntyre, AM, talk about a subject with which he is very familiar, Irish immigrants. Now, I think many of you will know of Perry's work. She has been focusing on 19th century immigration from Ireland for decades now, really. Her PhD is from the University of Western Sydney, and it was looking at the reunion of convicts with their families left behind in England and Ireland, and which she argues was the first assisted immigration scheme to Australia. Now, Perry was appointed a State Library Visiting Fellow in 2024, although I think she has been a regular habitué of this institution for decades now. She's also a highly respected historian, archivist and genealogist. She's been working for over 40 years and has published and spoken widely on immigration and family history. Now, today she's going to be talking about destitute families who found refuge in the workhouses in Ireland before the Great Famine of 1845. And Australia offered young single women with little prospect of employment in Ireland a totally free passage to Sydney, Port Phillip and Adelaide. And Perry's going to talk about who devised this scheme and why, who the key players were, and what the outcomes were for these young women in the colonies. It's been a fascinating project, which she has been working on for quite some time now, and she has been looking at the lives of 4,114 girls who participated in this scheme. So Perry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Callum, for getting us technically able. I'd also, in her absence, like to thank Rachel Franks, who I don't know that babysits is quite the word, but she sort of deals with our every needs in the horn room and elsewhere around the library and external from the library, and has been great for me to be a visiting fellow. As you said, Richard, I've been coming in and out of the library for longer than I'd like to remember. But this fellowship has really inspired me to get on and be a real historian now with other real historians, because of the amount of brilliant material that's in the library, and also the fellowship, to use that word, of other historians and people researching in the library at the time. So I'd like to thank you all. Because I could talk about this until dinner time tonight, I think I might just get started, if that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a 2-page introduction to hopefully the book that comes out of this, and then I'm going to work my way through some slides. So here we go. Until recent years, the contribution to Australian society of Irish women has not been broadly recognised. About a third of convict women were Irish. More than 1,000 young women came to Sydney and Hobart in the 1830s from foundling hospitals in Dublin and Cork. Approximately 18 to 19,000 Irish immigrants arrived in Melbourne and Sydney between 1839 and 1842, assisted by the government. Of these, about half were female. Gender balance was a defining characteristic of Irish immigration to Australia throughout the 19th century. In 1855 to 56, over 4,000 single women, young Irish women, arrived in Adelaide. Such infusions of Irish female blood had a telling influence on the development of colonial society. The so-called Earl Grey female immigrants sit comfortably within that tradition. And I say so-called because Earl Grey was the Secretary of State for the colonies and actually ran all immigration to Australia and Canada at that time. So this scheme to bring young girls from the workhouses was not necessarily just his. It was a part of his overview. The difference is that these workhouse young women that I'm studying stand as symbolic refugees from the Irish famine. They came from among the genuinely destitute class of Irish society, whose world had been torn apart by the tragedy of Ungwatermore, the Great Hunger. Many young women aged between 14 and 19, made destitute by the famine, were inmates of the workhouses. They were ready and willing to grab opportunities for a new life in the Antipodes and were called orphans under this immigration scheme, although about a quarter of them had at least one parent still alive. John O'Connor wrote a book named The Workhouses of Ireland, The Fate of Ireland's Poor, published in 1995. It's obligatory reading for the background of the workhouses. In his prologue, O'Connor says he was initially concerned with facts, figures, and associated laws, but slowly, quote, the pages came peopled with ghosts from the past. Not with names, these people were seldom named, he said. In the case of assisted immigration to Australia and New South Wales in particular, these people were not only named, but their native place, parents, age, and other details were also provided. For most of these Irish workhouse orphan girls, who are a subset of the general assisted immigrants to Australia at the time, we know exactly who they are. And it's this wonderful historical bonus for Ireland and Australia. This study deals with an immigrant scheme to bring single, respectable young women from the workhouses of Ireland during the famine years of 1848 to 50, only those 3 years. The famine actually started in 1845, and most historians in Ireland now suggest that it did go on until 1852. In just these 3 years, 48 to 50, 1,114 of these workhouse girls obtained a free passage to Australia. Unlike most other Australian immigrants, it was at no expense to themselves. How that immigration scheme was devised and what happened to these young women once they arrived in Australia is the major concern of this study of mine. There's no attempt to rehash some of the wonderful work on famine and poverty in Ireland, which has been written by previous historians. Nevertheless, the process involves much more than the seemingly simple task of looking at how these girls were permitted to immigrate from the workhouses during the famine, and a list of their names. How they were selected and moved from the workhouses all over Ireland to 3 different Australian colonies, Sydney, Port Phillip and Adelaide, Port Phillip still being part of New South Wales at that period. Involves huge number of organisations which identified suitable girls, and the immigration agent from Dublin went to each workhouse to make the final selection. The Colonial Land and Immigration Commissioners in London facilitated the complicated selection, chartered and managed the 20 ships on which they sailed from Plymouth. The assessment of what happened on board the ships and how these young women were received once in Australia is also addressed in my study, but I'm not speaking about that today. There's simply no time. As well as the immigration bureaucracy involved in the process, each girl had her own personal experience before going to the workhouse and after arrival in Australia. What happened when they landed and where were they housed? Where did they go to work? Who employed them? Who did they marry and where did they settle? Did they have a good, in inverted commas, life? And how do we determine such a largely unquantifiable question? Indeed, what is a happy life? It's impossible to establish what they thought, and no attempt's been made to put a 21st century perspective analysis on their lives. But the records provide glimpses through foggy windows when we look at as many as possible of these young women. Only a few died on the voyage. Some died young in the colonies from a variety of circumstances, yet others lived to old age, including Margaret McAvoy from County Down, who died aged 98 in 1929 after breaking her hip in a fall while digging potatoes in her Sydney garden. Ironic. There was no typical Irish workhouse orphan girl. Each had a unique life, even within the dehumanising spaces of the workhouse, or during the immigrant voyage, or in their lives in the colonies. Most of these young women got on, and as one descendant noted, were, quote, a sterling example of the best of Ireland and the contribution that country made to our history. That does not mean, of course, that every moment of their lives was happy. Many descendants who I've been in contact with and could not have done this work without have made similar comments about their workhouse ancestors. A small number did not have children, while others had very large families. The descendant of Sarah Jacobs near Mulligan from Banbridge in County Down provided lovely information stating that Sarah, quote, certainly did her bit, producing 13 children. The obituaries of a number of these women are glowing. For example, Margaret Ryan, who married David Murray in Victoria, had 12 children and died in March 1905. Her extensive and detailed obituary indicated that she was, quote, very much respected by everyone who knew her and her kind, endearing ways to all. I've worked on these girls with guidance initially from the work of Trevor McLaughlin in his 2 volumes Barefoot and Pregnant, of course housed in the library. Since the late 1980s, he has continued work on these girls, including blogs in more recent years, which have updated material about these women, kept contact with descendants, and continued to challenge and provoke those of us interested in these Irish women. The fantastic and detailed work undertaken by descendants and other historians, as well as my ongoing work on their individual lives, has added a wealth of information, which is almost too vast to deal with. In 1996, Richard Reid and Cheryl Mongan wrote A Decent Set of Girls, examining the journey of 100 of these orphan girls who were escorted to Yass by the sergeant of the Thomas Arbuthnot, the ship on which they'd arrived in 1850. Several studies of the girls from individual workhouses have been undertaken in Ireland, for example, Kay Cable on the girls from County Kerry. As we now approach 180 years since the first group was selected from Ulster workhouses in May 1848 and began their journey on the ship named the Earl Grey from Plymouth the following month, it's time to look at them as a group who bravely took on the challenges to leave the workhouses and during on Gorta Moor and seek a new life on the other side of the world. So basically, I've already outlined this, but I just thought you might like to see a few numbers here. Of the 4,114, and we know that precisely from the numbers selected in the workhouses and also the numbers of the girls on the ships. There were 20 ships which sailed from Plymouth in England between June 48 and April 1850. 2,253 went to Sydney on 11 ships, 1,255 to Port Phillip on 6 ships, and 606 to Adelaide on 3 ships. We've got very much detailed information from the Immigration Board's list on the 11 ships that brought the girls to Sydney. The 6 ships to Port Phillip aren't so detailed because there's no Immigration Board's list, only Immigration Agents list. And that anyone can email me and talk to me about that later, but they're the 2 passenger lists. And the 606 that went to Adelaide have very poor lists. There's one disposal list as the girls left England, but their only other listing of the girls to Adelaide is in the newspapers. So I'm also going to look, someone's popping up there, I'll ignore that, otherwise I'll get distracted. I'm going to look at, were they all Irish? How were they selected and from where? What happened when they arrived? How were they received? And their lives, outcomes, husbands, children, and longevity. How did I get interested? Well, many of you will know that I've been interested in Irish immigration since the late 80s. And in the early 1990s, I was very privileged to help Dr. Richard Reid, historian in Canberra, who's Irish born and passionate about things Irish, who did his PhD on assisted immigration from Ireland. He and I took tours of genealogists through the Society of Australian Genealogists to Ireland. And even though he's Irish born, both of us learned a huge amount about Ireland on the ground in the 19th century from doing those tours. In 1995, the then President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, called out to what she called the Irish diaspora in Australia, Canada, and other places where the Irish went, to remember those who were forced to leave Ireland during the famine or died as a result of it. Tom Power, an Irish-born immigrant who came to Australia many years before and had just retired from work in Australia, took up the challenge of Mary Robinson and with another group of people decided that they would build a memorial at the Hyde Park Barracks. Now, at the Hyde Park Barracks, because that was where the first group of women were housed until they were employed. It had been built in 1819 as a convict barracks. It's just up the road from the library, and I urge any of you, when you're in the city at the library, to take a break for 5 minutes and just walk up the street and look at this memorial. So the workhouse orphan girls. The background to the workhouses is simply and quickly, that is an overview of the Burr Workhouse in County Offaly that still stands. The Poor Law Act for the Relief of the Destitute in Ireland was passed in 1838 and came to Ireland in that year, and they decided to build the first of 130 workhouses. The first were up and ready for occupation by 1841. And of course, if you'll notice the date, 1841 was well before the famine of 45. So these workhouses weren't built for anything like the numbers that flooded into them once the famine hit. They were initially built for up to 300, but by 1845-46, they were overcrowded with several thousand starving and destitute people. 1848, assisted immigration to Australia recommenced under the Colonial Land and Immigration Commissioners. It had ceased, the immigration had ceased to Australia for a while. It had nothing to do with the situation in Ireland and England. It was about funding and bringing people to Australia. All right. Now I'm going to talk to you about what I'm doing, because I'm sure those who see me sitting in the special collection wonder what the heck I'm doing. But here we go. I've created a table, for want of a better word, because it works quite well. This is just the first page of it, of 28 pages, which shows that of the 130 workhouses, which I mentioned were built in the first phase of building the workhouses, the second phase started in 1848-49, and so none of these girls were actually selected from the second phase workhouses, and they were built by sort of taking off certain areas of the first phase of the workhouses, if you like. So they built another one in the same area and took some of the girls from the first phase workhouses into the second phase workhouses. So you just need to worry that there were 130 workhouses, and of those, 117 sent girls. The reasons why all of them didn't select workhouses might become clear. So this is just the first phase, which shows you that this is for Antrim, County Antrim, and in County Antrim there is several workhouses: Antrim, Ballycastle, Ballymena, and Ballymoney, for example, on your screen. The tick means that I have looked at those minutes in various places. For Antrim, in the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, which has a fantastic collection of material for the workhouses, both the minutes and the Hall or Guardian registers, or indoor registers as they're called, which is like registers of institutions here in Australia as well. Large double page that just gives you name, age, and a little bit of information about the inmates in the workhouse. So the middle columns were sent. Those two columns, and the reason there's two, to 14th of July 1849 and then afterwards, is that is from the third annual report of the Commissioners for the Poor Relief in Ireland in their report in 1848-49. And those are held in the State Library as well. If anyone ever wants to go and look at them, I can direct them to that. So, for example, for Antrim Workhouse there, we've got 13 before July 49, 18 after July 49, and a total of 31 from the Antrim Workhouse. And if you look in my right-hand column, I've identified 13, the tick meaning I've identified 13 on the Earl Grey and 18 on the Diadem. So you can see the sort of minutiae that I've been doing for these. Okay. One workhouse in particular, county in particular, Tipperary, there were the largest number from any one county. There were 477 from that workhouse, from that county. And they were divided into, as you can see on the screen, 23 from the Carrick-on-Suir workhouse, 70 from Cashel, etc. And the reason there were so many from Tipperary is because it was a big county and they had quite a number of workhouses. But you'll see at the bottom there, I've got plus 28 from Callan and 65 from Parsonstown Burr, which is in Offaly. That's because the Poor Law Union area covered part of Kilkenny for the Callan workhouse, so covered Tipperary and Kilkenny, and the Parsonstown one covered part of Tipperary and part of Offaly. So nothing is simple when it comes to Irish research. Another thing I thought you'd be all interested in is the statistics point. So if we're going to look at their literacy, on the immigration board's list for the ships to Sydney shows their literacy, which might be surprising to some of you. 938 or 27% could both read and write. 1,159 could read only, which is an interesting sort of 21st century thought. How come they could read only and not write? Well, I remember when I was young, we had a farm in a quite remote area, and the man that used to work for us said he only ever went to school for a little while and he only ever learnt to write his name. So rural workers who didn't use reading and writing perhaps lost the skills. And of course, there were 40% who could do neither. Were they actually orphans? From the shipping list in Sydney of the 2,253, we know that 40% had both parents alive. and that 416 had a mother, 135 had a father. So 591 had a parent alive, and 1632 had both parents dead. So that left 30 with unknown orphan status. I'll come back to that shortly. Relatives in the colony from the shipping lists again. 172 stated that they had relatives in the colony. Sometimes they named them and sometimes they simply said they had a relative in an unknown place. From my research, this is often understated. Many had a convict parent who had been transported that was not stated on the shipping list. 504 had sisters on the same ship or by another ship, or were already in the colony. Many had uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, a mother or a father, and in the case of the Stevens sisters, who I'll speak about shortly, had both parents alive. So perhaps not orphan as we know it. And orphan in the 19th century meant one parent had died, or they were cared for by the state in some way. So in many cases, those who went to the workhouses would have been seen as orphans in 19th century term, even if they had one or both parents alive. So I'm going back to the question on slide 1 about whether they were all Irish. Yes, they were all Irish in the sense that they came out of Irish workhouses. And as far as I've been able to gather, all had Irish parents, but not all were Irish born. 31, as noted below. 3 were born in Jamaica, 18 in England, 3 in Scotland, 1 in Wales, 3 in the United States, 1 in the Cape of Good Hope, and 2 in Australia. I'd like to just briefly tell you about Sarah Clark on the Earl Grey. She was noted as born in Jamaica. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, if you think about it for a second, her father was a soldier. On the New South Wales shipping list, both parents were dead, and she was in a workhouse in Ireland. So obviously he had gone back to Ireland and she found refuge in the workhouse. Whether he died back in Ireland or I doubt very much whether she'd have been sent from Jamaica back if he died there. So I'd say he would have gone back to Ireland as a soldier, and then she would have been gone to the workhouse. Her later life, she married and had 3 children and died in 1891 in the Sydney Asylum of cancer in 1862. So she ended up back in an institution. Martha Davidson, who arrived on the William and Mary in 1849, had been born in Sydney, and one of 2 who had been born in Australia. Martha was found in the North Dublin workhouse with her widowed mother, Mary Ann Davidson, who had managed to return to Ireland with her Sydney-born daughter, and they ended up in the North Dublin workhouse. Quite how she went back to Ireland with her young daughter is not known. But they were in and out of the workhouse 6 times from their first entry when Martha was aged 6 in October 1840 until her selection on the 18th of July 1849 in time to get across the Irish Sea to Plymouth to board the William and Mary, which sailed in July 1849. Just a tiny bit about selection in the workhouse. They had to be fit and well. The apocryphal tale that all these girls were destitute or prostitutes in the streets of Dublin is absolutely wrong. All of them had to be fit and well and aged between 13 and 19. There are a couple older than 19, but very few. All were provided with an outfit. This is a list of the outfit for each immigrant that was sent to each workhouse for the guardians to provide that workhouse, that material from the workhouse. Some of the girls were involved in actually making this material and their dresses, etc., in the workhouse. There was often a shoemaker working in the workhouse who made the shoes for the girls, and they were all given material. They were put in a trunk, and this is the one surviving trunk of Maria Halley, who came on the Thomas Abutna, and that is in Sydney Living Museums at the Hyde Park Barracks on display on permanent loan from the descendant of this girl. So you can go up and see it there. There's a bit of scratchy on the lid of that you can see, and that was where they pasted a list of what was in the trunk. So each girl had a list of what she had in her trunk. There's also a certificate for each immigrant, just certifying that her conduct was good and that she would be admitted to become an assisted immigrant. It was signed by Lieutenant Henry, as you can see there, from the Royal Navy, who was the immigration agent that went to each workhouse and selected the girls after the workhouse had initially selected them. He approved them. And then they were sent from the workhouse by dray or coach, or in some cases walked, depending on how far they were, to Dublin, and then for the first phase of their immigration across the Irish Sea to Plymouth, where they boarded the ships. Sorry, Portsmouth, what am I saying? No, Plymouth. Plymouth, sorry, forget Portsmouth, Plymouth. Over the years, I've managed to collect photographs. Trevor McLaughlin collected quite a number. We've got just about 200, the faces of the girls. I just think it's interesting to look at those very briefly and think about the fact that that survives and how varied they are, of course. Just back to selection in the workhouse for a minute. One of the best workhouse websites was put up by a man named Peter Higginbotham, who was working in Oxford. And it's simply workhouses.org.uk and can be accessed and has the most marvellous material about each workhouse in England and Scotland as well as Ireland, but for this study from the Irish workhouses. It even shows the Ordnance Survey map where the workhouse was sitting. As I've said, I went round each workhouse, well, not the workhouses themselves, but in Ireland, each county has a local studies, and they are the best places to go and do work for, whether you're doing genealogy or material for this kind of a study. The local studies in each county town in the Republic of Ireland is the place to go these days. For those in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland that are now part, in Ulster, that are now part of Northern Ireland, is the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland in Belfast. They have a vast amount of material. Some of them are putting material up online, but often it is still the best to go there. Might leave a bit of time for questions, but I've got a few slides that just give you some idea of the girls themselves, and I wanted to go to these because I think you'll find them the most interesting. Just a summary. So Alicia Armstrong, for instance, born about 1833, and I haven't gone into their lives in Ireland before the workhouses because it's just too difficult. Finding birth records in Ireland before civil registration, which didn't start in Ireland till 1864, is fraught with difficulties, particularly when you only know sometimes a county and not a parish. So it's very rare to find them. Some genealogists have done remarkable work and actually found their ancestors and their baptisms in Ireland, but it's not been part of my study. I start from the moment they go into the workhouse. So for Alicia Armstrong, you can see here, she's born about 1833. She dies in 1912. She comes on the Digby to Sydney. She's from Killashandra in County Cavan, and she married a colonial-born man Thomas Edwards, also called Ecott, in Port Macquarie, and had 13 children. And I acknowledge where I can where I got the photographs. Sometimes Trevor McLaughlin had these photos, and because he'd been working on them from the 1980s, he sometimes was not able to recontact the people who had sent him photographs. So sometimes he was not able to know who actually provided the photograph. Ellen Carroll on the John Knox, and I like this because she's sitting there looking extremely well-to-do with her husband with his almost top hat. They had 9 children. And Augusta Clark, who is the girl I mentioned before, who was from Jamaica, born about 1835, dies in 1909 in Port Phillip. And here she is with 3 of her daughters, all looking very well. Now, I don't know, I mean, people like Richard and I who grew up in Sydney will remember at the Rocks that you could go in and get dressed like this and have photographs taken back when we were not much more than children. So whether these were posed photographs or not, I don't know. But I think probably all these women would have had a good dress. So here she is with her 3 daughters in their good dress. Maria Cullinane, as she is on the ship, or Cullinane, to Port Phillip on the Eliza Caroline, had 9 children with Swiss vigneron Louis Neffenecker. This photograph was posted on ancestry trees, which I look at regularly, and where they're good, I contact those who've put up fantastic trees. There's some wonderful material on ancestry, but as many of you know, there's some other not quite so wonderful material because people pop it up without thinking about it. But this was a terrific photograph. Helen Donlan here with her husband Henry Mitchell. They had 12 children. I'd be sitting down if I were her after 12 children, not him, but that was the thing at the time. This was from the Milton Ulladulla Pioneers Index on the Mitchell family. Huge work done by local pioneers in Ulladulla. Whoops. Mary Doyle on the New Liverpool, and she might have her best dress on, but it's not quite as posh as the other ladies were earlier. She had 10 children. Descendant sent this photograph to Trevor McLaughlin when he was compiling Barefoot and Pregnant in the 90s. Jane Feeney. Now, there'll be someone online, I don't know if she's online, but this Jane Feeney is the ancestor of Christine Woodlands, who does fantastic DNA work for the Society of Australian Genealogists and guides people into their DNA ancestry. Jane is also the direct ancestor of Martin Killian, the director of the Sydney Living Museums these days. Between the work that Martin has done and Christine, they established that Jane Feeney actually had a mother already in the colony that was not noted on the shipping. And through their DNA research, they have managed to put together the life of Jane and her 3 husbands, which has been a remarkable voyage. And it would not have been able to have been done with DNA. Some of us have been into genealogy for many years, maybe a bit cynical about DNA, but it's often the only way that we can finally confirm these relationships. So thank you very much, Christine Woodlands and Martin Killian, for the work they did on Jane Feeney, and for Christine helping other people with their DNA connections. Mary Green came on the Inchinen here. She is with her husband, Thomas Davis. They had 13 children. Their 8th child was Arthur Hoey Davis, also known as Steele Rudd. Not a descendant, not an ancestor of Kevin Rudd, because that was actually not his name. His name was Davis. So just be cautious about what people put up about their ancestors. Mary McCarthy's probably one of my favourite girls. She looks quite severe here because this was found in the jail, photographic jail book at State Records. Mary initially married George Cooper and had 3 children. He died and she went on to marry Edward Young and had 11 children. And she had a pretty rough time with Edward. He was apparently abusive. And one day, in a fit of rage, he attacked her in the kitchen and she picked up a kitchen knife and stabbed him, causing his death. She was tried and sent to jail for only 3 months, the courts being somewhat sympathetic towards Mary's plight. But the last thing you'd expect to find a photograph of your ancestor would be perhaps in the photographic jail book in 1872 when this photo was taken of Mary. I like this because here is Cecily or Celia Moran sitting here with, or Celia Smith as she became, sitting here with some of her daughters and grandchildren in their home. Hannah Rafferty's a great story too. My thanks for Jim Edwards for this photograph. Jim was given an award by the then Irish Consul General for his work on her as an ancestor. He was so enamoured of Hannah that he used to carry this photograph around with him all the time. He worked enthusiastically with Trevor McLaughlin for many years and always turned up at the annual commemorations at Hyde Park Barracks. And you'll notice Hannah is very well dressed. She's got a little pin at her throat there, which reads Australia. So she might have been very much a workhouse girl from Castlereagh in County Roscommon, but she was also very much Australian, as were her 7 children and many, many grandchildren. This again is also one of my favourites. I mean, I can't pick a favourite really. Here's Mary Ann Ryan, who had 10 children with her husband, William Haythorpe. And look at the dresses on the girls. She's obviously made those dresses that are all similar. And here they are with 5 of their children, the little boy standing out to their father's left. It's just amazing what does survive from that period. Ruth Stevens is a very interesting case. She and her sister were the only 2 girls from County Wicklow on the Thomas Arbuthnot. This is a surviving picture of Ruth supplied by her Eli descendant in Tasmania. Their father was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1847. And interestingly enough, on the shipping list of the Thomas Arbuthnot, it says that both he and his wife were living in Sydney. But when you do the family history and the genealogy of this, they were actually both by then living in Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania. The convict description of Ruth's father is almost identical to Ruth herself. Broad forehead, wide face, and she's almost identical to her father. Brilliant story. And I'll leave you with this last one. Those that we don't have photographs for are memorialised all over Australia and Ireland in many ways, like this girl. Anne Ryan came on the Thomas Arbuthnot to Sydney from Scariff in far west County Clare and married John Howcraft and had 2 children. She was employed by Ned Ryan of Gaylong House at Gaylong down near Yass. She'd arrived on the Thomas Arbuthnot in February 1850 and was hired by Ned Ryan. She died after having 2 children and is buried at Gaylong House. She was not memorialised in any way, but the amazing work done by Cheryl Mongan, from Yass, who is a fantastic historian and genealogist, still living in Yass and doing remarkable work for the Yass community. She and Richard Reed were responsible for putting up this plaque to Anne at Geelong. I'm going to finish there. I know I'm a little bit early, but I know that there's going to be lots of you asking questions, and I've barely touched the side of it. But I'd like to finish, Richard, by saying one of my major problems, as you know, is that I'm basically a biographer, and how I write an overview story of 4,114 girls in a book that's going to be readable has been a big challenge to me. It could be a lot easier process for me to write a huge biographical dictionary, but that's not the aim of the game. I do want to give the Irish end of it a huge tick as well, and pay tribute to that end of their lives as well as their lives in Australia. So that's it from me at the moment. Thank you very much to all of you for listening, and I'm always happy to answer questions. I don't know, Richard, whether you want to give them my email address. I'm quite happy for that to be given out as well, but don't expect me to answer instantly.
Okay. It's the great danger of email, isn't it?
It is.
Now, there is a Q&A button at the top of your screens if you do want to send in some questions. We have a few here. It is an interesting challenge, I think, trying how you actually synthesize what you've got in terms of the quality and the quantity of information, and I suppose you look for patterns and so on.
Yeah.
One thing that occurred, the idea that you could emigrate the problem of poverty out of Ireland to another country, was that an established? I mean, was that why were these girls sent away? Just a way of getting rid of them, or a way of sort of exporting
thanks, Richard.
poverty?
I didn't address that, and I really should have. What happened was in Adelaide, the then commandant, if you like, of Adelaide had sent back to Ireland an idea that there were a lot of destitute but respectable poor in the workhouses of Ireland, and that Adelaide in particular really needed respectable women to balance all the workers that had men who'd come to Adelaide to build up the colony. So they had a lot more men than women in Adelaide, and so he sent back this message to Earl Grey to say, could you do something about it? So Earl Grey had started to look at the Irish workhouses that were absolutely flooded, as I said, with hundreds, thousands more people than they could cope with. And so this scheme, so-called, was devised to bring the respectable poor out of the workhouses to all the colonies on the east coast, so Adelaide, Sydney, and Port Phillip, to address an imbalance of sexes, but also to bring respectable domestic servants to the colonies, because even in Sydney and Melbourne, they really needed respectable women to work in the houses of not just the posh upmarket houses, but women who had 5, 6, 10 kids needed help in their houses, and these women were suitable. And they were suitable also because they had not so much house cleaning, domestic type skills, and they were often criticised for not being able to boil a kettle, but they had the skills of being able to milk a cow, plough a paddock, help around the house, and so they were very suitable in that sense. So that's how that happened.
So in a way, it was a kind of early sex trafficking in a sense. I mean,
well, it may well have been in a sense, but these girls weren't forced. They had to agree to go, and they had to sign a piece of paper. Unfortunately, we don't have any of those that survived, to say they would willingly immigrate. And I've got a couple of instances where they get to the port, they get either to Dublin or they get to Plymouth and say, sorry, I've changed my mind, I'm not going.
And they're allowed not to go.
They were allowed not to go, yeah. So they weren't forced in any way. And the same of when they were hired. There's instances in Hyde Park Barracks when they were hired out that they didn't like the person that hired them. And after a little bit of time, with that person, they broke their contract. They broke their indenture. They were hired as indentured servants, and the person that hired them, Mr. and Mrs. Neville, had to train them to some sort of domestic skill. And Richard Neville couldn't hire a girl by himself. He had to have Mrs. Neville there as well. So they weren't allowed to be hired by single men or men who had no wives to help, or people who ran pubs. They could be hired by publicans, but not living in the pub. So it was very, very regulated. And some of these women took their masters to court for abusing them or not paying them or all manner of reasons. They took them to court. They had, what's the word? Agency.
Yeah, well, and I mean, is there any indication of, I suppose most of them went into domestic service, did they?
Yeah, they did.
And is there a sense of their later professions? I mean, a lot of the photos you showed us, they seem to have ended up in, or some of them at least, in some degree of, maybe not comfort, but they certainly did.
Sure, but Richard, if you had 10 kids, you were very much the mother at home, even if you did have a nice dress.
Yes.
They were, and even in our mother's time, I mean, you and I, Richard, are sort of a similar age. We knew, if your mother had a job outside the house, she was maybe different. If you had a lot of kids, your work was at home looking after your kids, while your husband went out and tried to be the breadwinner. And many young people that are listening to this might think, oh, no, that's not like that. And my daughters-in-law don't believe me either, but there you go. That was the way of it.
Yeah. And so the sort of issue of education, I presume, was largely because of where they were brought up, and their poverty would have made education challenging when they were in Ireland.
Yeah.
Were they offered opportunities for education once they came to, particularly actually, the young girls? Or?
Even in the workhouse, there's some instances of them learning to read and write and be trained in some domestic way in the workhouse. But Ireland had a national school system from 1831, which was actually adopted in New South Wales in the 1830s. Our public schools, or public school as we call it, state school system was adopted from the national school system in Ireland. So, and they also had what were called hedge schools, where the kids gathered in the fields and learnt some rudimentary reading and writing. And you could see from those stats that I did before, a huge number of these girls who were all born about the middle of the 1830s. I put 1834, give or take 3 or 4 years, as their birth year.
Right,
had some rudimentary ability to read and write.
Yeah. And did the scheme stop, someone's asked, because the famine had you said the famine had dissipated, or sort of, dissipated, I suppose, by 1852. Did the scheme stop because there was not thought to be a need for it or anymore, or was it
the scheme stopped basically because the colonies started to object to the invasion of so many Irish girls at any one time.
Right.
Some of these ships had nearly 300 girls on them, and they arrived within a couple of months of each other. So you've got 600 young Irish girls aged between 13 and 19 arriving in Sydney or Port Phillip at any one time. And so it took quite a while to disperse them into various employment and settle them down. So that there was a cohort, I suppose, of people who objected. And that was partly the reason that they stopped it. But, I think there was a sense of shipping them out that was not seen particularly well in Ireland itself either.
So there was a sense that
there was a sense of, shoveling out our respectable poor when we might need them here.
Yeah.
But although that's not actually articulated anywhere that I could find.
It's a fascinating story.
It's a great story. And of course, after this period, by 1848, assisted immigrant immigration had also ramped up, and they were trying very much to bring respectable married couples who had young children, and the ones who had young girls seemed to get preference to bring out too. So they started to bring out young girls who had the support of their families, which started to balance this immigration.
Yes, I think my I don't know, some great grandfather or numbers of greats came out in 1854 with a wife and children.
Well, exactly, and after then too, Richard. Of course, it's not just the Irish. By the 1840s, you've got, and that's something, you know, I won't live long enough. I'd love to look at the English. There's huge numbers of English that come as assisted immigrants in that period, and perhaps we look at the Irish because somehow they're more romantic or whatever, but I think we look at them because there's not quite so many as the English. There's floods of English, and the Scots, of course, need attention as well.
And the data becomes so vast, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to deal with it. I don't quite know.
And proportions of Catholic versus Protestant, or are they all Catholic, or was that?
No, they're not all. They're not all Catholic, and the workhouses had both in them. There was not like here. There wasn't a Catholic institution and a Protestant institution. I haven't got my stats right in front of me, but there were quite a number of Protestant as well. I don't know if because I'm sharing my screen, I can't bring up my documents.
So. No, that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got to 12 o'clock. We'd obviously.
Richard, I interrupt you there for a second.
Yeah, sure.
Also, on that religion thing, a lot of people say, "Oh, my girl was Catholic; she would not have married a Protestant." There does not seem to be mostly that sort of a discrimination once they get to the colony. If you found a bloke you thought was okay, it didn't seem to matter whether you married in the Catholic Church or the Church of England Church. Sometimes they then, if a Catholic girl married in a Church of England church, they sometimes divided whether they baptised the girls or the boys in Catholic or Church of England. But often it was who was available to legally marry them at the time, whether he was Church of England Presbyterian or what. Doesn't seem to be a huge problem mostly. Now, I'm not saying that it wasn't, because we can't ask them, how did you feel when you married your Protestant husband in the Protestant church when you're a Catholic? Unfortunately, they won't answer that question.
Seems to have been a 20th century, but perhaps more of a
I think
concern
that very much
century.
was a 20th century. It's our mother's generation that weren't allowed to go to. I was brought up Catholic. I remember my mother being horrified. She wasn't allowed to go to friends' weddings because they were getting married in the Protestant churches.
Yeah. And it certainly split our family. Although at the end of the century, it was everyone got back together again. So, well, thank you, Perry. That's wonderful. And I apologise to everyone for the problems we have had with our HEC, which of course Zoom or Teams and Zoom are wonderful things till they're not, but this will be recorded, so you will be able to see the full presentation with the visuals. So just a reminder that we'll reconvene hopefully with our tech working in the first Tuesday of March, which I think is the 3rd of March, or the 4th, can't remember, and we're going to hear from Dr. Nicholas Pitt, who's a former fellow here who's been working on the Hawkesbury Benevolent Society at Windsor. So again, sort of looking at issues of how the poor and poverty relief is financed in New South Wales. So perhaps a bit of a segue from today's presentation. So thank you all. Thank you for your patience while we tried to sort out our issues. We will be back in a month's time. And thank you, Perry, for a really stimulating presentation.
Thank you all, and see you in the library soon, all of you.
Yes, excellent. Okay, thank you.
Bye. Thanks.